Hi everyone, welcome to week 10. This week we're going to be discussing the concept of identity, and chapter 6 takes this up within an early childhood context, while the article by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang interrogate this concept of identity in a time of late capitalism. So we'll be reading these two articles overlapping together and see what meaning emerges from them. So in Tuck and Yang's article, they're interrogating the ubiquity of identity. They provoke us to think about what the term and concept of identity might actually flatten. And they discuss it as sort of a surface level description or a term of what are really complex, socially situated subjectivities that are in a continual flux and reformation. And thus the term identity doesn't do justice to what it's actually trying to do. So this week, when unpacking identity, I invite you to consider this question. If we couldn't use the word identity, what else might we say? So Tuck and Yang write that identity is often an ambiguous surrogate for not talking about race. They write, quote, it can signal a project of self-actualization, and it can replicate the colonizing genetic lineage of the project of scientific racism still used to categorize indigenous peoples, end quote. So when taken up this way, identity becomes a prescriptive identifier of the other. It establishes categories and frameworks of knowing. So Tuck and Yang begin by highlighting their critique of the notion of identity, not as a discussion around self-identification per se, or liberation, but in many ways they discuss identity as it relies on categories of thought that are rooted in scientific rationalities which classify and separate complex relations and phenomena into knowable fragments. So they're refusing the hegemony of identity, hegemony or imperial or cultural dominance. So here they're arguing that the language and discourses of identity in current times, in times of late capitalism, are often taken up within a hegemonic sense. So it's used, as they say, as a currency, where identity becomes solidified into something for survival in a time of late capitalism. Yet, this way of knowing identity may be possessive and flattening. So in this article, the authors are pointing out that despite critical attention to identity as multiple and as an intersectional concept, housing factors like race, gender, class, etc., as they're in some ways this is proposed in chapter 6 actually, the term identity might actually be essentializing the self into a static image or fixity. So how then does identity exist beyond an image, beyond a fixity? How might we understand identity as a phenomenon, something that's continually produced and reproduced, without holding it down into something static? Whereas Tuck and Yang write, positioning does not precede movement, but rather it is induced by it. So they further say, quote, borrowing briefly from quantum physics, when we study a particle's position, we cannot fully apprehend its momentum. And when we examine its momentum, we lose certainty about its position. So intersectionality, or the study of how identities are interactive and composed of multiple components, and movement resonate in this uncertainty principle. So here they're saying that identity is thus a statement on positionality only made possible when movement is ignored. So a key concept of this article is this discussion of identity as a relational phenomenon, a phenomenon that is relentlessly lived and performed, similar to gender as we discussed last week in conversation with Judith Butler. And this performance is always in relationship with place. And here Tuck and Yang are speaking of place not only as a physical backdrop or a geographical location, but place as a series of lived social relations between humans, land, materials, and more than human others, plants, animals, other earth beings. So identity is performed in relation with these others and with these livelihoods. So how we come to know who we are is enacted in response to these others and the context in which we exist. So thus, place is central to the ongoing construction and action of identities, not as a static term, but as something that's always becoming and evolving. So within the context of Canada as a settler colonial state, conceiving of identity as enacted through and with place is particularly tensioned because place is laden with histories that continue to manifest themselves in present times and practices. So in thinking identity as a function of place, we can think then about how some bodies are privileged in place. They belong within the social construction of a settler colonial society on Indigenous lands. And some bodies are less so. Indigenous, Black, racialized bodies are displaced within the settler colonial state, or as Tuck and Yang write, they enact identities that are out of place. So if identities are tied to place, then the history of these places and how bodies move within these places matters. And as Stuart Hall writes, quote, cultural identities are the points of identification, the unstable points of identification or suture, which are made within the discourse of history and culture, end quote. And I think that this language that he's using, unstable, is crucial here if we're to think of identities as always becoming and less fixed, less banal. So identities rely on preconceived categories of race to operate, and thus serves and maintains colonial and imperial relations of power when they become defined by static terms. So following Tuck and Yang, in refusing identity, we might, quote, make room for other concepts, other specificities, other relationships that can bring about other kinds of resonances and futurities, end quote. So a central concept to hold on to this week is that identity is not a static characteristic. It is produced. So in this week's provocation forum, we'll be continuing to think through the arts as a medium for inventive and unstable thinking. So we'll be thinking with this question, if you couldn't say the word identity, what else might you say? So in this arts-based exercise this week, you're going to be asked to compose a poem, short story, an audio recording, or a series of photos like you did last week, following Tuck and Yang's provocation to refuse identity. So this composition should speak to what lies beyond the word identity. So in other words, you're going to use the arts, written, visual, or audio, to unsettle the confines or predetermined categories of your identity. So in decentering identity, what other understandings, stories, relations to place, histories, resonances, inspirations, tensions, or feelings emerge? And again, as I offered you last week, this exercise is flexible, interpretive, and most importantly, it's intentional. So your posts will surely emerge in multiple ways, but you will need to show here a depth of attention and critical thought that shows how you are making meaning, how you're unsettling and provoking inventive thought that pushes your knowledge beyond what you have already known as identity. So if you choose to use photos this week, please use original photos, not photos from Google or photos from online. What I'm interested here in is your doing. So how the act of composing something, writing, photography, might offer you new ways of looking, inventing, and gathering meaning in multiple ways. So your photos, writing, and audio do not need to speak literally, but rather I invite you to think metaphorically, poetically, and artistically to provoke us to examine identity beyond the categories that we already know. So you can get creative and experimental here. So yeah, I think that's about it. If you have any other questions, post them in the online forums and feel free to email me. And yeah, I look forward to seeing how you take up this exercise this week. Thanks, everyone.